Hi everybody, it's Chris, and welcome to another video by the Infinity System. Tonight we tackle episode 5 of Moon Knight, and this has been a tough one to review, as those of you who watched the video that we posted last night know. Without dwelling too much on it, we want to tell you that this is a very serious and heavy episode. This does deal with the trauma that Mark endures that makes him a system. And it's very realistic, so we recommend a heavy trigger warning at this point. Most of this occurs towards the latter half of the episode. Before we get to that, we will be issuing another trigger warning, so you guys have a straight heads up. With all that said, we're going to go ahead and give you just a brief brush up on our rating system. For those of you who are just joining us and haven't seen our other reviews, we've come up with a representation system based on the scales of justice, which will be playing a prominent part in this episode, which is from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. For each human heart that we award, it's a misrepresentation of DID. For each feather of truth that we award, it's a positive representation. So far, the episodes have been doing pretty well on the representation front, so we'll see what episode 5 has to bring. So all that said, let's go ahead and get into it. As usual, the first 2 minutes of the episode is basically a review of the previous, and as the episode begins, Mark abruptly comes to in Harrow's office. Harrow states that he, Mark, has been starting imaginary fights in the hospital. Mark states, "You're not a real doctor." Harrow, showing more frustration than we've previously seen him show, decides to play along with Mark and says, "Okay, I'm not a real doctor. Look, it's about you. We'll do it your way. Retrace your steps. How did you come to be here today?" Mark, obviously suspicious, still asks, "How did you get here?" Harrow responds, "I took the bus, like I always do." Seeming to ignore his statement that it's all about you, he continues to dominate the conversation. "You want to know what you told me? How you got here? You told me that you were in a place that was oddly reminiscent of this office, except in Egypt, and that you were with a rhinoceros." One heart for Harrow for doing more talking than listening, the first job of a therapist, despite telling Mark that it's all about you. As Mark corrects him, it was a hippopotamus, Harrow continues, "I'm sorry, you're right, it was a hippopotamus, but it talked. Now, what do you think? Is that sense or nonsense?" Mark begins to look doubtful and answers, "Nonsense?" Harrow then says, "I find this very encouraging. Honestly, I do. The struggling mind will often build places to seek shelter for different aspects of the self, from our most traumatic memories. It's called an organizing principle, okay? Some people see a castle, somebody else will see a maze or a library." Mark interrupts with a psych ward? Harrow leans back and says, "Yeah, could be a psych ward. What I find extremely interesting is this new animal character." "The hippopotamus?" Mark asks. "I find that very interesting," Harrow continues. "This hippo might break down the walls between you and Stephen, and we might finally understand." "Understand what?" Harrow goes on, "Well, before you got upset, you were talking to me about a boy. Do you remember that boy? Do you think you can tell me about that little boy?" So here we'll award one heart for leading the conversation, Harrow again contradicting himself about it's all about Mark. One feather for accurately, if obliquely, describing the dissociative process. One heart for not accurately describing the organizing principle, which is defined as a core assumption from which everything else by proximity can then derive a classification or a value. It is a central reference point that allows all other objects to be located or described. However, this is not the same as the internal landscape or mental construct such as the locations that Harrow describes, but instead is closer to the coalescence of the ego states, those parts of a child that describe basic emotions and sensations, hot, cold, hungry, etc., are basic perceptions that become integrated into an individual identity/psyche unless interrupted by repeated, intense trauma, as is the case with DID. Organizing principles are also those that a society forms, common experiences and beliefs that a group shares in common. So in this case, Marvel is tripping over its own feet and giving an inaccurate description of a basic psychological principle. At this point, Mark leans forward and suddenly his aspect and voice changes, switching to a rough New York-ish accent, signaling that this is likely the violent alter that has been alluded to before. The alter continues, "Hey, thank you, I feel really great." Leaning forward, he then picks up the sharp, pointy pyramid from Harrow's desk, because every good psychiatrist keeps sharp, pointy objects just begging to be used on their desk. And continues, I mean, they must pay you a lot of money in this place. Harrow then buzzes for the orderlies as our new alter continues. You're really good. I mean to tell you what, I feel like $1 million. I've never felt so good. I'm going to see myself out. Thank you. At this point, our orderlies from before show up and begin to restrain the new occupant of the body and begin to grapple with him. Pointing the sharp, pointy pyramid at Harrow, our alter continues, You're going to release that monster. He's going to destroy everything. He's going to destroy everything. Harrow, attempting to vainly calm things down, pleads again for the orderlies to be gentle. As they continue to restrain him, one of the orderlies readies an way overly large syringe to sedate him. Harrow continues, I am not your enemy. The orderly then injects the body with the OLS in the jugular, which is utter rubbish and would likely kill him, judging from the air bubble in said OLS. The body screams, and we're back in the hallway with Mark, Stephen, and Tawaret, right where we left off in the last episode. One heart for over-dramatizing sedation of a mental health patient, and more so showing an inaccurate and probably lethal procedure. No, definitely. No doctor anywhere is ever likely to inject anything straight into the jugular vein. Meanwhile, back in the hallway with Stephen and Tawaret, Mark grabs his forehead and states, Wow, these meds are really amazing. Tawaret asks Stephen, Is he always so intense? Stephen replies, Who, him? Yeah, pretty much. Tawaret asks, So are you two like twins? Mark says no, and Stephen states, Yeah, sort of. With understandable puzzlement, Tawaret continues, Well, great, that's really cleared up this whole situation for me. Mark then sarcastically says, Because it's always a good idea to be sarcastic to a giant talking hippo god in Egyptian regalia. Well, that makes two of us, because a second ago I thought I was shot to death. Tawaret, laughing slightly, says, Oh gosh, then this will really bake your noodle, but I think you were just taking a little time out. As Stephen and Mark stare at her, she continues, I'm afraid that you're actually quite dead. Mark and Stephen digest this, with Mark stating, Wait, I'm dead? We're dead? Stephen, realization dawning, confirms, Yes, I think she's right, Mark. We died. Tawaret, raising one finger, states, Actually, wait a sec, it's been a minute since we had a soul pass through here. Unrolling a scroll, she strikes a pose and intones, Welcome, gentle travelers, to the realm of the Duat. Stephen recognizes this process, stating, The Duat, the Egyptian underworld. This is Tawaret, goddess of women and children, and she's guiding us on our journey to the afterlife. Mark, not so thrilled, points to their surroundings. So this is the afterlife? The afterlife? Tawaret clarifies, an afterlife, not the afterlife. You'd be surprised how many intersectional planes of untethered consciousness exist. Oh, like the ancestral plane. Just gorgeous. Continuing, Tawaret states, Actually, I do have cards for all of this if you'll just wait. The hippo goddess then fumbles with a number of scrolls, again apologizing for her disarray. Mark and Stephen look at each other, with Mark clearly less enthused about this whole thing than Stephen is, who is basically grinning from ear to ear. Tawaret goes on to explain, Of course the true nature of the Duat is impossible for the human mind to comprehend. You may perceive this realm as something more recognizable to you. A psych ward is a first for me, but hey, we can roll with it, right? Stephen, clearly puzzled, asks the obvious question. Why would we imagine this realm to be a psychiatric hospital? Mark interrupts, stating flatly, Because we're insane. Stephen digests this, and Mark continues, growing more angry as he goes, We're insane, Stephen. Talking hippo, talking dead bird, you're outside of my body now, and now the afterlife? Right, that's the reality. And this, the hospital, that's the imagination. Okay, let's stop here for a moment. This is a tough one to judge because of the use of the word insane. While this may seem like an instant heart for using an inaccurate term with heavy implications to describe DID, this is actually a common fear when first seeking treatment. We ourselves were fully expecting the padded room treatment when we were initially assessed, and very concerned that we actually might be just that. Crazy, or insane. So, with these facts in mind, despite the use of a very loaded word, we have to call this one a wash, with no hearts or feathers awarded. Turning to Tawaret, Stephen apologizes as Mark continues. Oh man, Dr. Harrow's right. Stephen questions, Dr. Harrow? Mark continues, This is an organizing principle. Take right through these doors, for example. We go through there, and there's going to be a bunch of patients. Stephen attempts to calm Mark down and get a word in edgewise, but Mark's not having it and continues forward, ranting as he opens the double doors, only to reveal that they are most definitely not in the hospital, but in fact are on the deck of a large Egyptian barge, sailing over the sea of sand under a stormy purple sky. As Mark looks about in wonder, Stephen joins him. Mark asks, "What is this?" and Stephen replies, "This is the underworld." Mark, in amazement and relief tinged with doubt, asks, "I'm not crazy?" Now again, we see the use of a loaded word, crazy. But we also see a realistic depiction of the relief that comes through validation and eventually diagnosis. More than anything, we're afraid of being crazy, and that fear is a strong driver until you are diagnosed. Once you understand your condition, it's much easier to accept what's happening to you and to realize that, no, while you may have serious mental health issues, that things aren't as cut and dried as being insane or crazy, which itself speaks to the fear and uncertainty these loaded terms bring. So again, this one is a wash, no heart, no feather. Grabbing Stephen, he then asks of Taweret, "Where did you say we were going?" Stephen, obviously knowing everything about their situation, again displaying different alter skills and knowledge, tells him, "We're going to Arut, the field of reeds. Right, Taweret?" The hippo goddess stares at Stephen and goes, "Well, he's the smart one, isn't he? Well, if your heart's balanced in life, then you will spend eternity in paradise." As Mark looks about in wonder, she continues, "The field of reeds. But, before we get there, I just need to do a quick little, Stepping forward, she then sticks her hands inside both of their chests, withdrawing their two hearts, giddily stating, "Oh, look at that, it worked. Here's little old me worrying I'd blow your chests wide open." As Mark asks what she's doing, Taweret strides forward with the two hearts towards the ornate set of scales in the middle of the boat. Stephen, obviously clued into the process, along with everyone else watching at this point, states, "Oh, she's weighing our hearts on the scales of justice and the feather of truth. See, the ancient Egyptians believed that the heart was really the sort of who you really were in life, and if the scales balance by the time you end the journey, then the soul is permitted to pass into the field of reeds." Mark, still puzzled and not quite happy, asks, "What if they don't balance?" Turning to the pair, Taweret states, "You get thrown overboard! Whee! Poof! And the dead will then drag you down into the Duat, where you will remain frozen forever in sand." Mark, unable to help himself, and because it was written in the script, moves to the side of the boat as Taweret concludes, "No unbalanced souls on my boat. Them's the rules. Fingers crossed for you guys, though, heh?" Mark and Stephen stare over the side, looking out over the sands. Mark, suspicious, then whispers to Stephen, "I don't care what this hippo says. There's no way we're ending up down there, and we're not going to the field of reeds either." Stephen then asks what he's proposing. Mark flatly states, "If it comes to it, kill the hippo, steal the boat." Stephen is obviously not thrilled with this plan. Kill the hippo? Taweret, occupied with weighing their hearts, seems to be unaware of their conversation, or simply has heard this kind of thing before and pays it no mind, before calling them over to her as the scales swing back and forth. Stephen then asks, why is it doing that? Why is it moving like that? Taweret seems as mystified as they are at the scale's inability to balance and answers, "I don't know. I do not have a card for this." Removing the two hearts from the scales, she examines them, stating, "It's the hearts. They aren't full." With Stephen and Mark looking on in concern, she continues, "And trust me, I'm a goblet half full kind of gal, but it's like they each feel incomplete." Mark asks, "What does that mean?" And she replies, "Without balanced scales, the Duat will eventually claim your soul." Mark shoots Stephen a "I told you so" look as Stephen inquires of Taweret, "Do you have any suggestions?" The goddess turns and explains, "This boat contains all of a life's memories." As Stephen looks back at the door, she continues, "Now I don't know what you two guys have been hiding, but my advice, get in there and show each other the truth. Balance your scales before we arrive at the field of reeds, or your souls will be destroyed." The two then turn and walk back into the asylum construct. As Stephen inquires of Mark, "Do you think Layla's all right?" Mark answers, "Yeah, but for now, but if I know her, she'll go on a suicide mission to stop Harrow." Stephen states the obvious, "Well, that means we'd better hurry, doesn't it?" Mark then goes on to say that Layla would likely do what Mark has planned, that there's only one hippo, and that the ship can't be that hard to steal, and that they don't actually have to go through with this. Looking through the windows of the doors in the hall, Stephen responds acidly, "To what? Kill the goddess Taweret?" Mark continues, "No, you just find me a rope and then we can tie it up," and Stephen continues, "How about we just do what she says and help each other uncover what each of us is hiding, apparently." One feather here for showing Mark's growing unease at the prospect of uncovering his memories in front of Stephen. Peering through one door that contains the bathroom fight scene from episode 1, Stephen listens to Mark continue. Look, Stephen, I don't know about you, but my memories are a fricking mess. Staring at the fight going on, Stephen pointedly states, yeah, mine too. Hearing noises that sound suspiciously like the pounding coming from inside the red sarcophagus from the previous episode, Stephen turns away from the door and crosses the hall to peer into the window behind them. He then sees himself and Khonshu turning back time to determine the location of Amit's tomb, with Layla looking on as before. Mark, seeing this for the first time, remarks, wow, that's wild. And it is. That was a cool scene. Stephen turns away and peers through another door, this one showing a scene that we haven't seen before, of someone who is apparently Mark standing on a street in front of a red car drinking. Stephen asks what it is, and Mark, obviously uncomfortable, deflects. It's a street. I mean, how many streets have you walked down in your life? Pointed question coming from him. Again, we're showing Mark's instinct for denial kicking in, but since we've already awarded for it, no change. Before Stephen can answer, they hear a small boy yelling for help. Moving down the corridor, Stephen follows the call for help, opening another door and stepping inside. Mark runs after him and both stare at a cafeteria full of dead people sitting at tables, complete with canopic jars. Stephen quips, well, guess whose room this is? Yours! Curiously, we again see that several tables only contain 3 jars, which probably means nothing more at this point than sloppy prop work. With the scales from the boat still rocking from side to side in the middle of the room, they look about and, as Mark examines each and determines that they are all the people that he killed on behalf of Khonshu, the worst of the worst, as he tells Stephen, that this is what Khonshu meant by protecting the travelers of the night. Stephen asks Mark, you remember each person? To which Mark acidly replies, you try taking a life and see how quickly you forget. I kept wishing I'd fail and that one of them would kill me instead. The healing ended up being a curse. One feather here for a realistic, if oblique, depiction of the guilt, blame, shame cycle. Despite having no real choice and even knowing that those he killed on Khonshu's behalf deserved it, Mark is overcome with remorse at his actions and in turn blames himself, hoping for absolution and destruction from each person killed. This also ties into what we'll see later. Examining the still swinging scales, Stephen tells him that the scales are slowing down, that the recovering of the memories is working. Stephen then asks, who's that? The camera pans in to show a small boy, doubtless the one yelling for help, standing in the room. Stephen then asks the obvious question on all of our minds. Why is there a child standing in a room with people you've killed? Mark is silent until Stephen begins to approach the boy, gently asking his name. Rather than answer, the boy turns and runs, heading out of the room and away from Mark and Stephen. As Stephen runs after him in the hallway, Mark tells Stephen to wait, to not follow the boy. One feather for showing Mark's increasingly desperate attempt at denial of a past trauma and attempting to shield Stephen from it. Opening the door behind the running boy, Stephen then turns and locks it behind him, trapping a furious Mark outside of the memory that Stephen has just entered. As Mark screams at Stephen to open the door, Stephen turns, only to discover his/their mother tending a barbecue, asking a boy she calls Roro if he's hungry. We cut to a shot of Roro, then drawing a picture of a goldfish with one fin. Where have we seen that before? As the camera pulls back, we see that Roro is in fact Mark's brother, confirmed when their mother tells Mark not to tease his brother. Stephen, amazed, then states, I had a brother? As he watches, the young Mark says to Roro, I'm not hungry. Want to go to the cave? Roro nods and states, we'll eat later, moving away from the table and past the pair's father, who is building a clubhouse. As they move away, their mother reminds Mark, what do? Keep an eye on your brother, okay? With a nod and a later gators, the pair move off as their mother completes the catchphrase. After a while, Crocodile. Is this perhaps an allusion to Amut? As Stephen follows the pair, a highly agitated Mark searches the asylum for another way into the memory. We cut back to Stephen, who is still following the boys through what is now a thick forest. Thunder rumbles overhead in the background, no doubt a presage of the trouble ahead. As the two boys move through the forest to the cave, Roro states, okay, but I'll be Rosso this time. Can you hear that, Dr. Grant? Playing along with what is obviously the dialogue from our cheesy Indiana Jones knockoff, Mark states, "Sounds to me like danger." Hearing this, Stephen questions, "Dr. Grant?" As it begins to rain, Roro reminds Mark, "Mum said not to while it's raining," to which Mark rejoins in typically ignorant child fashion, "We'll be fine, don't be a baby." With Roro giving a doubtful look at the camera, the pair move off, Stephen in tow. Meanwhile, back in the asylum, Mark is still furiously pacing the hallways, obviously dead set on stopping Stephen from witnessing what we all know by this point is going to happen. One feather for showing a representation of what amounts to the headspace, and an alter's ability to control the front while keeping another at bay. Now, while we have had alters such as Christopher take over the body by sheer force from time to time, this exact scenario is not something that we've experienced. But as several of you have commented previously, this is something that can happen. Moving after the pair, Stephen then steps on the skeleton of a bird whose head looks a great deal like Khonshu and also presages what we know is just ahead. As the two boys enter the cave, and with the rain now beginning to pour down, Stephen follows after, noticing that the water has begun to form a stream heading into the cave. As Mark still furiously paces through the asylum, Stephen puts two and two together and realizes the danger to the boys. Moving through the cave after them, Stephen calls to the pair, telling them, in what is obvious futility, that it isn't safe and they need to get out of there now, that the water is rising way too fast. Continuing to flash back and forth between the memory and the asylum, an increasingly desperate Mark still searches for a way in. With Stephen still following after the two boys yelling warnings, Mark suddenly comes face to face with his mother in the window of one of the doors, and she doesn't look happy. As Stephen repeatedly calls for Mark, we begin to hear the two boys yelling for help, now realizing that they are in over their heads, literally and figuratively. Back in the asylum with his eyes closed, Mark repeats, "It's just a memory, it's just a memory. Damn it, Stephen." The camera pans around to show that the window in the door now shows what is obviously a wake after a funeral. After looking in, Mark tries the door, and this time it opens. With the door closing behind him and a picture of Roro prominently displayed on a table, the camera cuts to Mark's mother, looking haggard and grief-stricken to the point of dissociation, numb to everything around her except her pain. One feather for a realistic depiction of the emptiness that death and grief can bring, and how this can trigger what is essentially a dissociative state, which can be experienced by anyone under extreme duress. With her father moving to sit by their mother, a dripping wet Stephen is now in the scene as well, staring in shocked horror. Mark notices him, and as the pair watch, their mother intones, "I want my Roro back." Stephen turns and looks behind him to see a young Mark uncertainly standing on the stairs looking down. With what can only be described as hate-filled eyes, their mother notices him and states, "What are you doing here? You were supposed to keep him safe." As Stephen looks on, shocked, Mark tells him, "Let's go." Cutting back to the young Mark, we hear his mother continue her cruel rant. "You let him drown. This is all your fault. This is all your fault." One feather for realistically showing how an adult can take their anger out on a child. An easy target for inappropriate emotional release. As the mourners try to control her, the young Mark runs upstairs as older Mark attempts to stop Stephen from following after. Stephen ignores him and hurries up the stairs as Mark pleads, "Stop! Don't go up there!" As Mark reaches the top, we see that the scene has now shifted to a new memory. Mark's father pleading vainly for their mother Wendy to come join them at the table for Mark's birthday. Young Mark flatly states, "She's not coming," as his father explains that, "Your mother's not feeling well. We'll just do it ourselves this year, okay?" With no other choice, young Mark then blows out the candles on his cake, with a growing emptiness and pain clearly written in his eyes. One feather for showing with gut-wrenching clarity exactly how the cycle of abuse can affect a child whose parent blames them for something that they had no control over, again reinforcing the natural guilt and shame present for vindictive purposes. Hearing Mark call after him, Stephen turns his head and runs up the stairs again, symbolically heading towards the eventual revelation that Mark does not want him to see. He looks on as we witness yet another birthday, but this time, Mother is in the room for it, and she's obviously become an alcoholic in the time in between. As Mark's father desperately tries to make the experience a positive one and temporarily leaves the room, leaving Mark alone with his drunken mother, she moves closer, and as older Stephen looks on, cruelly slurs out an accusation. "You were always jealous of him, ever since he was born. I should have known you would do something like this." Angrily, the young Mark throws his plate on the table and flees the room. Horrified and beginning to grow angry, Stephen looks at her in disbelief and states, "Mom, what are you doing?" before moving off up the stairs after the distraught young Mark, who slams his bedroom door shut. One feather for showing a very realistic depiction of alcoholism, and less directly, how grief can turn to substance abuse. One feather for accurately showing the mental manipulation that abusers use to reinforce the guilt, blame, shame cycle they have already set in place and use it to hold power over a child. And for showing a very realistic depiction of the abused child and their reaction, who is trapped between the two representations of their abusive parent, the one that apparently loves them and the one that abuses them. Instead of expressing their anger towards where it rightfully belongs, at the parent, they will instead choose to internalize it and turn it in on themselves, reinforcing the abuse. Hearing older Mark still calling after him to stop, Stephen resolutely opens the door but is quickly pulled back by Mark, who has caught up with him. The two now appear in a street outside as Stephen furiously asks Mark, "What happened in the room, Mark? Why are you remembering her like that?" A grim-faced Mark keeps moving Stephen away as he continues, "That isn't what she was like." As Stephen desperately tries to return to the memory, he asks, "What are you hiding? Why won't you let me see?" Before Mark can respond, the scene shifts again to a much older Mark with duffel bag in hand, being followed by his father, who states, "Please come back. She'll get help. We'll fix this." As Mark bodily moves Stephen away, the younger version of himself spits angrily at their father, "You're supposed to fix this. Why haven't you?" Finally breaking free of Mark, Stephen moves back to witness the scene as his father replies, "I cannot lose another son. Please." One feather for showing how substance abuse and mental health issues can cause a rift within a family, and how those involved can cling to the idea/memory of their loved ones, hoping that they will simply get better until it is almost or entirely too late to control the collateral damage. Oddly, knowing this can serve to further drive the cycle of self-loathing that even abusers can feel, which is then, of course, used as another reason to inflict more abuse on the child. Mark then tackles Stephen, stating, "You're not supposed to see this," as the pair shift into yet another memory, this time the desert sands near what is obviously the dig where Layla's father was killed. As Stephen asks, "Where the hell are we now?" Mark hangs his head. Stephen continues, "Harrow said you were a mercenary, that you killed hostages." Lifting his head, Mark asks him, "And you believe that?" Stephen shoots back, "Yeah, I wouldn't put it past you." One feather here for showing inter-system strife and skepticism between alters regarding the truth. As the camera pans about the scene of death, Mark states, "Turns out going AWOL in a fugue state gets you discharged from the military. Didn't have a ton of options after that." He then explains that he went to work for hire for his previous commanding officer, Bushman, that the job was to raid an Egyptian tomb and that Bushman had changed the plan, calling for no witnesses, and that Mark couldn't live with that decision. The camera moves in on a body which Stephen realizes is Layla's father. Mark states that he tried to get them all away, but that they didn't make it. Stephen then asks, "What happened to you?" Mark points off camera, and as it pulls back to reveal the tomb, half buried in the desert sand. As the pair move closer, we see a trail of footprints, blood, and a discarded gun. And finally, Mark, gravely wounded and crawling towards his statue of Khonshu. As the pair watch from the entrance, the wounded Mark, knowing he is dying, prepares to commit suicide. But before he can pull the trigger on his gun, the voice of Khonshu speaks out. What a waste. Obviously startled by this, Mark brilliantly states, "Huh?" Khonshu continues, "I feel the pain inside of you." Looking up at the statue, Mark asks, "What the hell are you?" Khonshu then introduces himself and states that he is in search of a warrior. As older Mark and Stephen look on, then Mark laughs, well, good luck with that. Khonshu continues, to be my eyes, my hands, my vengeance, to be my final word against the evildoers, to bind your very being to me and eradicate only the worst, those who deserve it. Perhaps echoing Tom Cruise in an Interview with a Vampire, Khonshu then asks Mark, do you want death or do you want life? As a bitter now Mark looks on, unable to alter the deal he knows he is about to make, Mark replies, I don't know. Seeming to peer deeper within him, Khonshu states thoughtfully, your mind, I feel it, fractured, broken, most fascinating. You are a worthy candidate to serve me during this time. One heart for using the highly loaded term broken to describe DID when in fact it is an incredibly strong coping mechanism, literally rewiring the brain itself in order to survive the trauma. One additional heart for Khonshu deliberately using this as a manipulation tactic on Mark. As now Mark moves closer, we see the scales from the boat once again are present as Khonshu continues. In exchange for your life, do you swear to protect the travelers of the night and bring my vengeance to those who would do them harm? With a sudden string orchestra providing appropriate tension, Stephen remarks, that sneaky old vulture, he was manipulating you from the start. Mark states, no, he kept us alive. Stephen, unwilling to let the point go, states, Mark, he was taking advantage of you. Bitterly, Mark replies, or just giving me away to keep being what I've always been, a killer, clearly referring to the death of his brother and everything that has followed after. One feather for Stephen recognizing Khonshu's manipulations and for telling this to Mark. A very important realization to make when dealing with the denial and imprint left behind by the guilt, blame, shame spiral set into place by an abuser as they blame the child itself for the abuse, as we shall see later on. Khonshu then presses his advantage. Do you swear to protect the travelers of the night and bring my vengeance to those who would do them harm? At the end of his rope, then Mark agrees. Yes. Stephen draws now Mark's attention to the scales, which seem to have balanced. Have we done it? Have we balanced them? Before now Mark can answer, we're treated to the transformation sequence we've all known was going to happen. In typically flashy and overblown Marvel style as Khonshu intones, then rise, rise and live again, as my fist of vengeance, as my Moon Knight. Whereupon Mark is encased in the suit and the music crescendos to a close. Stephen, watching the transformation, then hears monkey sounds inexplicably behind them and turning asks, baboons? With an angry now Mark shooting a glance at then Khonshu and following after, Stephen and he move forward and the pair appear back on the boat with several baboons inexplicably running around the deck as Towerett looks on, playing absolutely no part in what's to come. As they move nearer, Stephen asks Towerett, what's going on? As we're treated to a spectacle of what look like purple shooting stars raining down into the sands, Towerett explains. Unbalanced souls are being judged and sent to the sands before their time. Oh, this is bad. This is really bad. This is evil. Obviously referencing Harrow's work for Amut, and oddly leaving out the fact that perhaps she should have noticed this fact before any time now. As she looks on, Stephen tells her, do you see now why we have to go back? Towerett, clearly out of sorts, states, even if I could send you back over there, you'd just be returning to a body with a bullet in it. You wouldn't be able to heal. As Mark and Stephen absorb this fact, Stephen asks if they can send word to Layla to free Khonshu, asking Towerett to help them. The Hippo Goddess then asks, are you sure you want to be with Khonshu again? It seems like you really want to get away from him. Mark admits, I did, but this is our only shot. Agreeing with him, Stephen pleads for Towerett to help them. The goddess then states, what the heck? Osiris is not going to like this, but his gate is the only way back. Before seizing the rudder and moving the barge to a new course, sending Mark and Stephen tumbling against one side of the deck in the process. Towerett then tells them, get back inside, you don't have long. You have to get the scales balanced. As the boat continues to make its sharp U-turn, Mark and Stephen heed her words and move inside the asylum construct once again. Back inside, Stephen tells Mark that the scene in the bedroom that Mark pulled him away from must be what is needed here. Mark desperately pleads for them to stop, stating that they don't need to go back through it all again, and that they can just talk, and that Mark will tell Stephen everything. begging for Stephen to not make them go through it again, that it's not worth it. One feather for again showing Mark's increasing attempts to hide the truth from Stephen, because that would mean reliving the trauma himself, something that he desperately does not want to do. This accurately portrays the difficult struggle when learning about your condition, the need to know everything that happened to you versus whether or not you truly do need to know, and the continuing need to suppress the memories, caused by both the brain itself and the after effects of the trauma. Stephen refuses to believe that seeing the memories is not worthwhile, stating, "Not worth it? Mark, we're about to lose everything. Do you understand? If we don't get back, then Harrow succeeds and all those people die. If Layla dies, that's on your head. It will be all your fault." Which, obviously, given what we've just witnessed with Mark's mother, is precisely the wrong thing to say. With predictable results, Mark is then triggered by the phrase and utterly freaks out, screaming, No, I won't go back, you can't make me do it," while violently slapping himself repeatedly about the head, continuing to scream, "You can't make me." And suddenly we find ourselves once again back in Doc Harrow's office, with Harrow begging Mark to stop. One heart for showing an alter committing a violent act on the body. While the depiction of self-harm can be accurate, in this case it's used to drive home the crazy, insane, violent patient trope. One feather for showing how certain phrases or stimuli can trigger extreme reactions in a trauma victim, commonly termed as being triggered. Sadly, this term has come to be conflated with a simple outsized emotional reaction to ordinary stimuli that are not related to trauma. For example, the utter bullshit that has pervaded our society of late and served to poison our perceptions of each other over things as simple as, sexual preference, religious preference, economic status, and in general any divergence of opinion from one group to another. The terms snowflake, soy boy, and owning the libs come into mind. These are utterly ridiculous generalizations of things that we should not be spending our energies on, and a bastardization and minimization of the term's true descriptive purpose, to describe the reactivation of a previously intensely traumatic event. Sorry, but seeing someone wearing a mask in order to prevent an infectious disease from spreading and then feeling personally attacked by this common sense measure does not count as being traumatized or triggered. Grow up, people. The planet is dying around us, and we don't have time for this bullshit if we want to survive as a species. Try thinking for a change and focusing on something that actually matters, shall we? Moving on. Panting and out of breath, Mark turns and grabs the side of his neck, asking if Harrow injected him with something. Harrow then slowly states, "You watch too many movies, all right?" Once again giving us that oily grin and an evil chuckle, continuing, "We can't involuntarily sedate patients these days unless it's absolutely necessary." Touching his nose, Mark discovers that it is whole and not bloody and broken as it had been in the previous scene. As Mark looks about the room, Harrow continues his speech, pouring them both a glass of water. "I'm so proud of you. What you've been doing is so difficult. Reliving these traumatic memories can be so painful." Dabbing his face with a scarf, he continues, "They can be so real, and you have been at it for hours. Great work." Moving forward with the water, he offers a glass to Mark. "You've been peering inward, looking deeply into all of the moments that make you, you." Handing him the glass, Harrow continues, "I'm so proud of you." One feather for Harrow showing what is an important piece of therapy, positive validation, and an accurate description of the difficulty of trauma work. However, this is almost immediately devalued by what happens next. As Mark stares at his reflection in the glass of water, Harrow continues. Now, just stay with me one sec. I want you to consider this. Do you think you created Stephen to hide from all the awful things you feel you've done in your life? Or do you think Stephen created Mark to punish the world for what your mother did to you? Do you know? Can you remember? One huge heart for Harrow using what is clearly inappropriate leading of a patient in order to meet the therapist's idea of how things should progress. This is not best practices, and if you have a therapist that plants this kind of double-edged manipulation, look for another. In one sentence, Harrow is placing Mark in a mental trap. Either way, he's to blame. either for creating Stephen to hide or Stephen creating Mark for vengeance purposes, planting an inaccurate picture that definitely does not serve to deal with the complex issues at hand. Flatly, this calls for a new therapist. Sadly, Mark seems limited. As Mark seems to digest this double-edged manipulation disguised as psychiatry, Harrow continues, "There's only one way to know. You're going to have to open up to Stephen. There can be no progress without understanding. Can you do that? Can you open up to Stephen?" At this point, we are coming to the quick of the matter, and here, as we said before, must issue a very strong trigger warning. The following scene and description of it can be extremely upsetting to trauma victims. Those of you who watched our video from last night know this. Looking back at his reflection in the water, Mark says nothing, but we are greeted with yet another shift in memory as a young Mark angrily sweeps a pair of Dr. Grant and sidekick action figures off the desk in his bedroom. Angry and deeply scared, young Mark begins to rock back and forth while Mark and Stephen look on. Stephen looks around and states, "This is my room. I remember some things, but I don't remember this." With young Mark still attempting to self-soothe next to a mirror, he is startled by an angry knocking at his bedroom door. As Stephen looks back, we hear young Mark begin to desperately chant, "It's not her. It's not my mom. It's not my mom." The knocking grows louder, and older Mark closes his eyes in pain. As the camera cuts back to young Mark cowering in fear, we see a pair of wooden scales nearby, with a pair of nunchucks close at hand, the very weapons that Stephen pulled from the suit earlier in the series. One feather for showing how a child will attempt to self-soothe by assuming a fetal position and rocking back and forth. This is a very common unconscious soothing technique, and we do it all the time. One feather for showing an accurate denial by young Mark, in effect closing in and beginning to dissociate from the trauma. Their mother's voice comes angrily from the door. "Mark, open this door. Open this door right now." Holding himself in a fetal position, young Mark continues his verbal chant. "It's not my mom. It's not my mom. It's not my mom." As the pounding grows increasingly more violent, we see young Mark suddenly switch into what is obviously the birth of Stephen. This is confirmed as Stephen takes on the accent and begins to hurriedly clean the room, stating, "Bloody hell, look at the state of this place. Better tidy it up before Mum sees it." This last is echoed by the reflection of older Stephen, looking on with dawning realization at his own creation. One feather for showing realistically the sudden shift that comes as the dissociation reaches its ultimate conclusion. The sectioning of the ANP, or apparently normal part, away from the trauma that the EP, or emotional part, is about to endure. As young Stephen desperately begins to clean the room, his mother's furious knocking and yelling continues. "Mark, open this door now!" As they look on, older Stephen's attention is drawn to a poster on the wall above his younger self. A poster of the very same cheesy movie from before, Tomb Buster. Stephen slowly reads the catchphrase, "When danger is near, Stephen Grant has no fear." Finally, older Stephen puts it all together. "You made me up." One feather for showing that Stephen is not only an EP, but also a fictive, based on the movie that Mark and his brother Roro were obsessed with, and identifying with the hero of it as a source of strength. Mark may not have the wherewithal to endure the abuse, but Dr. Stephen Grant does. Older Mark is unable to reply to Stephen's statement, and their mother finally breaks open the door. Avoiding looking up, young Stephen continues to tidy things up as their mother moves into the room and removes a belt from the wall. "You're going to learn to listen." She then moves towards the helpless boy to beat him as a horrified older Stephen and Mark look on. Moving out of frame, we hear the belt jingling as their mother hatefully says, "Why do you have to make me do this?" As older Mark pulls Stephen from the room, older Stephen tries to watch the scene, stating, I want to see what she did." Mark does not reply, pulling him from the room. As he does so, we hear the sounds of Wendy whipping young Mark with the belt, telling her son all the while, "You disgusting human." So let's pause and unpack that. One feather, unfortunately, for providing a very realistic depiction of an abusive parent and showing the verbal and emotional abuse that often presages and accompanies physical abuse itself. We can attest from personal experience that the phrase, "Why do you have to make me do this?" is all too common. the abuser absolving themselves of the blame for the abuse by placing the onus on the victim, in this case the newly formed Stephen. This is an insidious manipulation tactic serving to create and reinforce the guilt, blame, shame cycle. The child is made to feel guilty for the abuse, being told that it's their fault or that they made them punish us. This then leads logically to the child blaming themselves, turning their anger again inwards instead of it being directed rightfully at their abusers. This then leads to shame that is reinforced both by the internal conflict and their abusers as a control measure, completing the cycle back around to guilt, and on, and on, and on. One feather also for a realistic, if marginally tasteful, depiction of intense physical abuse. Even though we do not see it, we know what's going on. As older Mark pulls him from the room into the asylum construct, he tells Stephen, "You don't need to see that. You're not meant to see that. That's the whole point of you." Aghast and angry, Stephen then suddenly punches Mark in the jaw, sending him reeling, a callback to the previous punch that Mark laid on Stephen. Holding his hand in pain, Stephen spits out, "The point of me?" As Mark wipes the blood from his mouth, Stephen continues, "What, to be your stress ball? All this time I thought I was the original, but I'm just something that you made up." One heart for drastically misrepresenting the purpose of an EP or emotional part, in this case Stephen. It is the EP that holds the trauma. They are the ones who endure it so that the ANP or apparently normal part's psyche, in this case Mark, can survive. Not vice versa. In fact, it is Mark that is not supposed to see or endure the abuse. That is the whole point of dissociation and the final creation and sectioning off of the alter and traumatic incident so that the ANP can continue to function normally. Sorry, Marvel, but you got this one completely backwards. One feather for Stephen expressing that he believed that he was the original, or the core. This is a common fear among systems when they first learn of their multiplicity. Your sense of self becomes strongly disconnected, and the core can begin to wonder if they are in fact themselves, or simply another alter. Am I an ANP, or an EP? Mark, moving forward, tells Stephen, "You got to live a happy, simple, normal life. You understand?" Stephen bitterly replies, "But it was all a lie, wasn't it?" Mark then states, "So what? What does it matter? What, you want to remember the truth that you had a mother that beat you, that hated you, that made your life a living hell?" Stephen backs away, stating that Mark is just trying to upset him. Again, Marvel is showing things in reverse. Since it was Stephen who took the abuse on Mark's behalf, it is Stephen that is the EP, and by Mark's own admission has been suppressed until just recently, as we're about to see. It is Mark who has been functioning in the outside world, able to do so by Stephen's presence within. One heart again for getting this fundamental principle of the theory of structural dissociation utterly backwards. With a psychiatrist on staff advising Marvel, this seems an egregious mistake to make. Did they not proofread the script before filming? While DID can be complicated to untangle, there is no excuse for this error, which only serves to further confuse the audience and promote inaccurate information regarding DID and dissociative conditions. Mark continues, "But you got to live, thinking that she loved you, that she was kind." And then Mark drops the proverbial bomb, that she was still alive. Stephen refuses to believe this, stating that he talks to her every day, as we have seen previously, except that they were all messages that Stephen was leaving and not actual conversations. Mark goes on explaining to Stephen that his father had called after all these years, telling Mark about his mother's death and asking him to come sit Shiva with him, the Hebrew mourning of the dead. Mark states that he just couldn't do it. Stephen refuses to accept this and grows increasingly upset, repeating, "No, no, this is all wrong. Let me out, let me out, let me out." As Mark moves towards him, we suddenly pop into Harrow's office again, except that this time, it's Stephen in the body. This is instantly verified when, spying Dark Harrow, a startled Stephen promptly throws the water in his face, and then promptly apologizes for it, attempting to clean Harrow up. Doc Harrow then calls him by name. "Stephen, it's good to see you again." Stephen then backs off and, looking around the room, asks if this is some kind of a test. I recognize this place. Doc Harrow then informs him that he is his doctor and that he's here to help him. Stephen, unbelieving, spies a diploma on the wall and states, "Wow, you've really gone up in the world, haven't you?" A slightly moist Harrow, leaning back, tells Stephen, "I never expected to see you again." Stephen still isn't convinced and remarks on Harrow's haircut and silly little stash, finishing up with a sizzling, very Ned Flanders. Harrow attempts to steer the conversation, telling Stephen that it's Harrow's fault for asking Mark to open up to him. Yeah, no shit, Harrow. If you hadn't been dead set on pushing your interpretation and pet theory on your client, perhaps things wouldn't be going better here, Since we've already awarded for a heart for this clearly bad practice, however, we'll move on. Stephen tells Harrow, well, he lied to me, that's what he did. Harrow presses the point. What do you feel he lied to you about? To which Stephen shoots back, nosy. As Stephen paces about looking at the room, Harrow informs him that when you first came in here, I was afraid that you were never going to acknowledge Mark. Stephen seems puzzled and asks, I brought us here? Harrow continues, after your mother passed. Stephen bristles, pointing at Harrow and stating, don't say that. That's not true. That's not true. Growing increasingly agitated, Stephen tells Harrow he doesn't want to hear it. As Harrow attempts to placate him, Stephen warns, you say that again, you say my mother isn't alive, and I will freak out, I promise. Leaving out the fact that he's already freaking out. Harrow then asks Stephen if he would like to speak to her, picking up the phone to call as Stephen looks on, protesting that Harrow doesn't have the number, does he? Harrow informs him that, oh yes, they do have the number on file. As Harrow calls on the phone, Stephen grows more fearful and agitated, telling Harrow not to call. Harrow ignores him, asking the switchboard operator to call Miss Grant. Interestingly, not Spectre. Telling the operator, yes, I know, just put the call through. Informing Harrow that she won't answer because she screens all her calls, Stephen stares as Harrow says, it's ringing, and then lies, pretending to be talking to Stephen's mother. Stephen would like to speak to you. Holding the phone out to Stephen, Harrow asks, would you like to speak to your mom? Tears streaming down his face, Stephen holds the phone and tells Harrow, my mom is dead. This grim statement is confirmed as we hear a dial tone issuing from the phone. One heart for again showing that Harrow is a really shitty therapist, deliberately forcing his client to face their misperceptions of reality. A good therapist, again, does not lead their client, but allows the client to set the pace. Pushing issues, especially with DID, will only cause more damage and more conflict rather than providing any resolution by facing up to the truth. Solid Hollywood bullshit here and a gross misrepresentation. As he accepts the truth, Stephen closes his eyes and suddenly we are in another memory as the camera focuses on a picture of their mother. Dressed in black and cluing us into the fact that we are witnessing her Shiva, Mark's father stares out of the window and sees Mark standing on the other side, drinking next to a red car. The same scene that we witnessed earlier. As Mark and his father stare at each other, Mark's father gestures for him to come inside. Mark refuses, shaking his head, no, before moving down the street. Mark continues walking, stating, nope, not gonna do it, won't give that woman the satisfaction. Stephen stares as Mark moves down the street, tears blinding him as he cries. Emitting the type of sounds that can only come from unbearable suffering, Mark falls to his knees, overcome. As Stephen watches, Mark rips the yarmulke from his head and throws it against the ground, beating it with his fist in frustration. Immediately, he picks it up and clutches it to his chest, stating, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, over and over again as he rocks back and forth in the middle of the street, completely overloaded and unable to cope with his conflicting feelings. One feather for showing very realistically the impact that triggering events can bring. In this case, Mark being put in the untenable position of sitting in remembrance of his mother, who is also his abuser. This essentially causes an unreconcilable conflict between Mark's love for what his mother used to be and his anger and hatred towards the abuser she became. The statement, "won't give that woman the satisfaction," is a dead accurate depiction of how a trauma victim becomes caught between the need to express their anger by lashing back and the guilt they then feel for expressing the emotions that they are entitled to. A sick continuation of the lifelong guilt, blame, shame cycle from before. This eloquently demonstrates the lingering effects of abuse, that even after the abuser is dead or removed from the picture, their influence and the consequences of the abuse and trauma are still borne by their victims. We can attest to this entire scenario firsthand, as this anger has become a weapon of sorts against our abusers and their control. We refuse to give up or surrender because to do so would be to prove our abusers right, something that we will not permit. While this is in essence a form of empowerment, it can become a double-edged sword, as the patterning from the abuse still conflicts from within. As the camera pulls back from the struggle, we see a breathless Mark suddenly switch to Stephen, who looks about and states, "What? Where am I?" Rising to his feet, he states, "Oh, not again," pulling out his cell phone to talk to his mother, telling her that he won't believe it, but I'm totally lost again. One feather for showing a decent representation of a time loss or blackout, which is one of the defining criteria for a DID diagnosis. As Stephen watches his memory replay, Mark appears and studies the scene and flatly tells Stephen, "This is it, Mom's Shiva 2 months ago, the moment our lives started bleeding into each other." We see memory Stephen moving off, and Mark continues, "I just couldn't face all that again, all the things I had done." Stephen then tells him, "Mark, all those horrible things that she said to you, she was wrong. It wasn't your fault." Mark shies from this, stating, "It was my fault. I never should have brought him to that cave." Stephen grabs his shoulders in support and again says gently, "Hey, you were just a child. It wasn't your fault." A double feather for Stephen telling Mark the absolute truth, that it wasn't his fault and that his mother was wrong to say so. This simple validation is one of the hardest things and yet one of the most necessary things to feel, again setting up an internal battle between the actual truth and the truth drilled into you by your abusers. We want to believe that we were not at fault, but we have to fight against years of conditioned abuse in order to do so. For some, it's a bridge too far, and we may never truly believe this, but patient repetition from others of this fundamental truth may eventually bring some small measure of peace. Mark absorbs this, nodding, before suddenly the ground begins to shake under them. Stephen tells Mark, "It feels like we just stopped." Figuring it out, he gestures to Mark, telling him that they have reached the gates of Osiris. Hurrying from the memory, the pair find themselves back on the deck of the boat, asking Taweret what happened. Taweret stands in awe of the gates of Osiris and tells them that she's never been so close to the gates to the world above before. She then informs them that she's sorry, but their scales did not balance and now their journey has come to an end. She informs them that she cannot stop the inevitable, but does state that she was really rooting for you guys. As Mark and Stephen stare at the scales, she tells them the bad news, that the unbalanced souls of the Duat must now claim theirs. As we look on, the scales are still tipping from side to side as the ship slides through the sand, heading towards the gate. The sailing does not remain smooth for long, however, as we begin to see the aforementioned unbalanced souls emerge from the sands before clambering up the side of the boat as Mark and Stephen look on. As more and more souls begin to clamber on deck, Mark tells Stephen to hide. As Stephen cowers behind an utterly see-through stand holding the scales, failing miserably at said hiding, he watches Mark do what Mark does best: fight. As the inevitable plot point progresses, Mark is chagrined to discover that the souls are not so easily put down, merely dissolving into sand when they are hit. As one pins Mark down and is joined by yet another lost soul, they wrestle Mark to the edge of the boat, attempting to throw him over the side. Seeing Mark in distress and getting no assistance from Taweret, Stephen seizes control of the rudder and turns the boat sharply, sending Mark and the refugees from Dune sprawling back across the deck and out of danger for the moment. Having only bought a moment's reprieve, Stephen watches as Mark begins to take a beating before being dragged back to the side again. Reasoning that since he is Mark as well, Steven makes good on the body memory comment from episode 4 and rushes to Mark's aid, depriving one of the Sandlot specials of a bat, which he soon puts to good use on its former owners. With a surprised but relieved Mark staring, Steven yells, "6!" As another mobile anthropomorphic nightmare shambles unnoticed behind him, Steven explains to Mark, "I prefer cricket." Finally noticing his danger, Steven turns and makes short work of the creature, literally cutting it off at the knees before shattering its head into a cloud of sand. Going full Hulk on the remains of the critter, Steven bashes the bat into it repeatedly as a shocked and incredibly stupid Mark ignores the danger of being too close to the side of the boat, and is promptly rewarded with his personal Darwin Award by yet another tall, dark, and desiccated monster grabbing him from behind. As Steven runs towards them, the creature attempts to topple Mark overboard. Keeping up with his newfound burst of testosterone, Steven attacks the Roomba-killing revenant in order to save Mark, succeeding, but falling over the boat himself in the process. As Mark watches in horror, we see Steven and the creature hit the sands below. Mark cries out as the boat moves further away, moving on without Steven aboard. We watch as Steven picks himself up and runs after the boat, stumbling through the sand as he tries to catch up. As Mark begs Towerette to stop the boat, we see Steven begin to flounder in the sand as it begins to suck him down. As Steven, Mark, and our guts absorb this, we see the process accelerate as Steven reaches out for the retreating boat, slowly turning to sand until the life goes out of his eyes. As a string quartet begins to play from some unknown location, Mark again pleads with Towerette to stop the boat. As he does so, the scales at last balance with a resounding and fatal-sounding clunk. Towerette moves towards it, telling Mark that the scales have now balanced. As the camera pans to Mark, we suddenly see that he is no longer on the barge, but instead is standing in what we can only surmise is the field of reeds. As Mark looks about, we hear what sounds for all the world like luau music rippling through the landscape. As the camera pulls slowly back, the music continues as the scene and the episode at last come to an end. No hearts or feathers here, as we can't decide if the balancing of the scales after Steven's apparent demise is simple misrepresentation that the death of an alter will fix the condition, in this case Mark's soul standing in for proxy, or if it's simply a plot device to bring drama to the story and set up what will hopefully be an eventual rescue of Steven. With Mark apparently now in residence in paradise, we're left to wonder just where and how the series will be wrapped up, especially with our as yet unnamed alter in the show, not the comics, yet to be properly revealed. Will he play into the picture at all, or was he just a one-off nod to the intricacies of DID? We'll have to see. So let's go ahead and tally up our Hearts and Feathers awarded this time around. And as we can see, once again the feathers outweigh the hearts with 10 hearts to 27 feathers of truth. Again, the feathers outweigh the hearts as Marvel's trend of decent/good representation continues. While there have been glaring exceptions and misrepresentations shown in the series so far, Marvel's depiction of DID and dissociative disorders has been among the more positive to come out of Hollywood to date. That they have put effort into getting it right is obvious. The question now remains whether they can continue this trend and wrap up both the story and their depiction on a positive note. That's it for this time, guys. Go ahead and let us know your thoughts in the comments section below on the episode, our review, on Moon Knight, on DID, whatever you'd like to talk about. We'd like to go ahead and take this opportunity to thank you for subscribing, to welcome all of our new viewers that have found us through the Moon Knight content, and to remind you, as always, that you are loved, that you are strong, and that you are not alone. I'm Chris. Thanks for watching.